before listening to this sermon, if you could please read Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18. The title of this sermon is The Beauty of Impurity and the Rise Before the Fall. So firstly, the beauty of impurity. Now, the Disney film Beauty and the Beast is all about the deceptiveness of appearances. A beautiful enchantress disguises herself as an old woman. She's treated unkindly by a prince because of her appearance. The enchantress casts a spell on the prince, turning the once handsome prince into a beast. Over time, the beast learns the error of his ways and falls in love with a girl named Belle. Belle learns to look beyond the beast's appearance to the beast's changed heart, choosing him over another handsome admirer who was actually a selfish beast inside. Appearances are deceptive, and because what we love is often dictated by appearances can be a dangerous thing. In Revelation chapter 17, John describes his vision of a great prostitute called Babylon. This great prostitute is called Babylon because Babylon was the ungodly place of Israel's Old Testament exile. Israel spent over 70 years, that's an entire lifetime, in this ungodly place. And so Babylon is used in Revelation as a symbol of the ungodly world in which every believer spends their lives. So, basically, you and I live in Babylon. As Christian believers, we live in a place of exile before we reach our eternal home. We live in an ungodly world in which the pull of sin is very strong. Babylon in Revelation chapter 17 symbolizes all of these things. So, Babylon the prostitute. Well, in order to become a great prostitute, you clearly have to have an appearance that turns on the opposite sex. No prostitute makes a living by being ugly. And so the great prostitute, Babylon, is described by John in the following way. Verses 4 and 6. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great. Continuing on a bit later. Then I saw her, I was greatly astonished. The great prostitute's appearance is stunning. So stunning that godly John responds in an astonished way. John had earlier responded in awe to his glorious vision of Jesus in chapter 1. But in one moment of visual saturation, John's awe is now directed towards something else. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you so astonished?" God's angel quickly rebukes John in order to save him from the deceptiveness of the prostitute's appearance. For if John was left to himself at that moment, there was every chance that he would have been led astray. Beauty is deceptive, particularly when it takes on a seductive form. That's why Babylon is represented as a great prostitute. A great prostitute because the ungodly world that we live in, like a prostitute, lures us and tempts us towards sin. Babylon is represented as a great prostitute because Babylon is pictured as a great prostitute because Satan, the king of this ungodly world, is great at doing his job. Just a few examples of how good a tempter Satan is. Adam and Eve were drawn to the good appearance of an ugly fruit. Despite living in a perfect world, Satan deceived Eve into thinking that the one thing that was forbidden was the most attractive. King David was led astray by Satan's temptations. The most godly man that ever lived was led astray through Satan simply asking David to have a second look. Every human being who has ever lived has been deceived by Satan. Satan has been successful at arousing the sinful nature in every woman and man since the beginning of time. There is no defense that Satan hasn't broken down. There's no ugly thing that Satan hasn't made look attractive. There's no amount of knowledge that Satan cannot undo in a second. Satan can make a person who knows right and wrong forget about it in an instant, simply through the attractiveness of something else. That's why John stood in the awe of the great prostitute. That's why we are so attracted to sinful things. That is why God makes sure He introduces the prostitute to us, rather than letting the prostitute introduce herself. What do I mean? Well, every good parent has a responsibility to introduce the idea of prostitution to their child. Somewhere between the ages of 8 and 18 approximately, every parent goes about educating their son. Letting the prostitute introduce herself to their son on their 18th birthday, well, that's a recipe for disaster. That young adult then will be flattered by all the attention. That young adult will be distracted by the prostitute's appearance. That young adult will be attracted by what the prostitute has to offer. And we all know what happens next. Flattered, distracted, attracted, and then battered. Battered in the sense that so much in that young boy's life is destroyed in a simple act of saying yes. Their wealth of knowledge is destroyed. The parental education of 18 years is destroyed in one moment in which a prostitute made sin appear as good. That teenager's moral integrity is destroyed. The next time they encounter a prostitute, saying yes will be so much easier. That teenager's entire future is destroyed. Whatever direction they were heading in life before, they're not heading in that direction now. Now their thoughts and money are going to be invested in repeating what they enjoyed the night before. In order to avoid such a battering, parents need to introduce the idea of prostitution to their children, warning them of their deceptiveness, warning them of the deceptive beauty and the impurity that they may lead them towards. So, parents need to introduce the idea of prostitution to their children, and we need to know, we need God to show us the deceptive beauty of impurity too. And that's why we read in verse 1, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters." This great prostitute, remembering great prostitute, it represents Babylon and is symbolic for the ungodly world in which we live. The world that tempts us. This great prostitute is described as sitting by many waters. In other words, Babylon's brothel is easily accessible to all. No matter where you live, there is a whole world of ungodliness and sin ready and waiting to lead you astray. And the longer you live in a place, the more its culture begins to become your culture. And in much the same way, sin so easily becomes the accepted norm in our lives, simply because sin is the general direction of the world. We read in verse 2, "With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Even kings are described as becoming the prostitute's victims, the ones who with the most moral knowledge in that time and in that civilization. Kings were the people with the ones with the most moral knowledge, and yet, even though they had the most moral knowledge, even though they have the most alternative marriage options available. Even these kings are symbolized as succumbing to the prostitute's temptations. Why? Because Babylon got them drunk. In much the same way, no amount of biblical knowledge or length of time as a Christian can ultimately protect us from succumbing to temptation. All Satan needs to do is take our eyes from God and point us towards some attractive sin, and we're as prone to sin as anyone else. Satan gets us drunk by dulling down our conscience and making us pay less attention to what God's word says. It's for these reasons I am very glad for verse 3. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. The wilderness in the book of Revelation is repeatedly used as a symbolic place of both testing and protection. And in this passage, the testing involves the temptation and lies that we're exposed to by living in an ungodly world. The protection given us comes through God showing us the prostitute's true colours. In verse 3, then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The great prostitute is shown to be an employee of both the red and scarlet dragon that we met in chapter 12 and the beast we met in chapter 13. The prostitute is clearly linked to both of these. This is shown us by the woman being dressed in red and by her riding a scarlet beast. In other words, Satan, the red dragon, is at work in the ungodly world that we live in. Satan uses the influence of the world around us to lead us astray. The intention of such beastly tactics are to deceive and to destroy. Workplace attitudes, the TV and media, the accepted philosophies of the world, all of these are ready and waiting to lead you and I astray and destroy your faith in God. You'll probably have experienced the flattering of sin. Sin is advertised as wanting to make us happy. You'll probably have experienced the distraction of sin. The world that we live in points us away from God and points us towards ourselves. Sin makes us prioritize our own honor and our own pleasure as opposed to focusing us on the honor and pleasure of God. The flattering of sin, the distraction of sin, and the attractiveness of sin. We're all prone to that, aren't we? Sin appears to us like a beautiful prostitute that is satisfying when given into. And lastly, the deception of sin. We live in a world in which sin is judged to be morally okay. God protects us from such things by showing us the great prostitute's true colours. Despite the apparent beauty of impurity, sin is always ugly and always wrong. Sin is always ugly and always wrong. Verse 4. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hands, filled with abominable things, and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, and of the abominations of the earth. What is beautiful to the world is abominable to God. No matter how sweet revenge might look, no matter how white a lie might be betrayed, no matter how much greed is rationalized, no matter how much fighting back is praised as being the right response, no matter how many times something wrong is described as being innocent, no matter how many others are doing it, Sin is always abominable and always wrong. Don't let the beauty of impurity lead you into being deceived. We need to see sin as God sees it. And in verse 6, the true colours of sin is revealed. Verse 6, I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. You know, this verse, it seems a little bit out of context. Verse 6 speaks of the woman drunk with the blood of Christians, a symbolic way of describing one of Satan's tactics, the power of hate. Satan uses the power of hate to cause Christians to be persecuted. And verse 6 shows us the corpses of these Christians lying on the ground. But though verse 8 may seem out of context, speaking of the power of hate in a passage that is all about the seducing power of love, even though this verse might seem out of context, it reminds us that Satan's only aim is to steal and to kill and to destroy. Satan's goal is to destroy the faith of a Christian, be that through the hatred of persecution or the seducing power of love. That power of love being when the temptation of sin is so strong that it destroys the faith of the believer. You know, Satan desires to see corpses on the ground, both physically and spiritually. Satan wants to see Christians compromise on their faith, see Christians distracted from their faith, see Christians giving up their faith. And many times, sadly, Satan is successful. Many Christians compromise on their faith through accepting the cultural norms of the world around them. Many Christians get distracted from the faith through materialism or through worldly pursuits. Many Christians give up their faith because something or someone eroded away their love of God slowly. Perhaps bitterness, perhaps a relationship, or some other priority eroded away their love for God till they had no love for God left. If you've seen these things happening to other Christians, know for certainty that it could happen to you. Satan desires to see corpses on the ground, both physically and spiritually. So ask yourself the following question: what tactic would Satan use if he was going to destroy you? You need to know the answer to that question so that you may be prepared for when temptation comes your way. What would Satan attract you with? What voices in the world would he cause you to listen to? What areas of life would he find you put at the least resistance? Don't be deceived by the beauty of impurity, and make sure that you are aware of the rise before the fall. So secondly, the rise before the fall. I'm just going to read verses 7 to 14 again. Not the most simplest verses in the Bible to understand, so I'll do my best at trying to explain what I think they're referring to. Verse 7 of chapter 17. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss, and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is, not, and yet will come." This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings, along with the beast. They have one purpose, and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So these verses are not the most easy to understand, and there's no consensus among Christians about exactly what is symbolized by these 7 heads, which also symbolize 7 kings. But as with all difficult verses of Scripture, we need to do a couple of things. Firstly, we're to use clearer parts of the Bible to help make sense of less clear parts of the Bible. And also, we should, when we're reading hard bits of Scripture, we probably need to realize that it probably isn't teaching us something new. It's probably teaching us something that we already know in a different way. And what we read in the next chapter of Revelation, chapter 18, is very clear. It's very clear, even though the words before it are very complicated. The message of chapter 18 is very clear. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Though Babylon will rise, it is described as it is described as certainly going to fall in the future. That's the very clear message of Revelation chapter 18. The very clear message of these 2 chapters is that the ungodliness in the world around us will rise and then fall. The powers in the world that persecute believers will rise and then will fall and have their power reduced to nothing. Levels of sin and ungodliness will rise but then fall when Jesus comes again and deals with all the ungodliness and sin. Lies about God and the meaning of life will continue to be taught and believed until the time when Jesus comes again. But after that, all these lies will be exposed as untrue. Chapter 18 clearly describes such a fall, a point which is also emphasized in chapter 17. Basically, as I see it, the 7 heads and 7 kings are symbolic of all of history. So these 7 kings represent the powers that will exist in the world that we live in throughout all of history. It's a little bit like the way pictures of 5 ape-like humans are used to represent the entire history of evolution. I'm not getting into an argument about do I believe in new evolution or not at this moment, but we can all picture that little picture, can't we? 5 ape-like humans are used to symbolize the entire period of evolution. In much the same way, the 7 heads and 7 kings are symbolic of all of history. And as we look back on history, we see that every great world power has risen and then fallen, no matter how great it is. Verse 10 symbolizes this for us by describing the 5 past kings who have all risen and then fallen. Rise, then fall. 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 Looking back on history, we can all see this pattern, can't we? All powers that have been the greatest power in the world have risen and then fallen. The Babylon Empire rose and then fell. The Persian Empire rose and then fell. Alexander the Great rose and then fell. And then the Roman Empire rose and then fell. Revelation symbolizes this pattern by pointing us back to 5 symbolic kings who have all risen and then fallen. And then verse 10 describes one king who is, i.e. who is currently reigning. Now we can all probably see some power in the world around us that seems to be currently reigning. For example, perhaps the communist government of China that seeks to powerfully control its citizens. It certainly seems to be rising, to be powerful at this moment in time if you're a Chinese Christian. Or perhaps you can see the influence of Western materialism that powerfully makes us want certain things. Or the power of modernity, post-modernity, that powerfully convinces us that there is no such thing as absolute truth. As we look around us, we can all see powers that, like kings, exercise a great deal of power and influence in the world. This is symbolized by the sixth king, which leads on to a seventh, and then to an eighth. Verse 10 reminds us that all such powers that are currently in existence, and all such powers that appear in the future, they will all rise, and then fall. Verse 10. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is currently reigning. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7th and is going to his destruction. Summarizing all of history, we can all look back and see powers that have risen and fallen. We can all look around us and see powers that exert their influence in the here and in the now. And in the future we will all see that the influence of Satan and the beast are set to rise, working through governments, philosophies, worldly desires to lead people astray more and more between now and the time when Jesus comes again. That's why the 8th future king is connected to the satanic beast in chapter 13. And this is what we see from looking at the world around us. Levels of persecution, levels of false teaching, levels of unbelief, levels of immorality and idolatry. Look at the world around you and you will see that all of these are on the rise. We look back and see powers that have risen and fallen. We look around us and see powers that exert their influence in the here and now. And when we look forward into the future, we see that the influence of Satan and the beast are set to rise. But remember, all that opposes God and God's people will one day fall. Verse 12. The beast who once was, and now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings, along with the beast. They have one purpose, and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. No matter how much you do or do not understand these verses, understand this. The emphasis is on the rise before the fall. Levels of persecution, unbelief, deception, immorality, all of these things through which Satan does his work will rise and then fall. This is the information God is symbolically trying to hammer home. This is the information, and this is the practical response. Verse 4 and 5 of chapter 18. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her," that is, come out of Babylon. "Come out of her, Babylon, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes." We cannot leave the world physically, but we can resist the influence it seeks to have on our lives. When the power of hate causes us to be persecuted, remember that what rises will one day fall. No matter what pressure you are under, and no matter how much rejection you might face as a result of being a Christian, remember that such things will one day end, and that God is the only one you should care about living to please. When the power of love and lust tempt you towards idolatry, remember that what rises will one day fall. The greatest treasure the world has to offer will one day be worth nothing. Every failure to give God glory and honour will be looked back on with regret, whereas a life of love and obedience to God is the only life worth living, and the only life which we will look back on with no regret. When the power of lies are on the rise, and people believe so much that is untrue, remember that what rises will one day fall. One day God's truth will expose all lies. And on that day, all who have built their lives on such lies will forever regret it. So the application is, we're to live according to God's truth now. Beauty is deceptive. The beauty of impurity is a lie. Appearances are deceptive. Even if a life of sin and ungodliness appear to pay off now, they will not pay off in the end. For all that now rises will one day fall. Verse 10 of chapter 18. Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. Don't get caught up in this Babylonian world that we live in. Instead, get caught up in a life of love and obedience to God.